the Go Berserk with Email podcast with Navy nuclear engineer turned email software developer, Troy Broussard. So calm.
I'm pissed off, but I'm telling this because I am teaching you how to think differently and how to test differently.
So patient.
And Ben, that's put $500,000 into this company too, is being told that nobody can find the goddamn bug.
So charitable.
I'm going to start paying bounties every time somebody finds a bug. We're going to deduct $10 that week.
So trusting.
Do not assume that anything works. Assume that nothing works.
And so sweet, it makes sugar taste just like salt.
I want to play into the sexiness of marketing automation, but I also want to slap the complexity of it.
The Go Berserk with Email podcast begins now.
So we're back again, boys and girls, for another Go Berserk with Email show. I keep wanting to call it a podcast. Why is it a show, Troy? Are we entertaining people? What is this?
It is entertaining. Come on, man. If you're not entertaining, then you're dead. So what the hell is the point of doing a podcast that's boring, right? So come on. We gotta mix it up a little bit, have a little entertainment. You can't see me on this show, or you'd be laughing at my yellow glasses that I'm wearing here. It's all in the entertainment factor, Jonathan.
You look sophisticated, brother. So what do you have in store for us in today's episode?
Well, one of the things that I get questioned about a lot by entrepreneurs is this concept of innovation or trend following, right? And a lot of people get confused in which direction makes sense for them. And I have a very strong stance on how I do it, but it's not necessarily what's right for everybody. And so, do you follow the trends of what's working out there, or do you do your own thing? And that's really the question. And we're going to dive into all angles of this today.
Now, I thought you were just a trendsetter doing your own thing.
I am. I really do just stay on my own thing. I'm an innovation guy. I focus on innovation. I have this firm belief in what I do and confidence in what I do that I will find enough people that like what I do and resonate with the way that I do it, that I can make my earning from that, and I'm not going to think twice about it. And that is my approach. It is very much the Steve Jobs approach, right? When Steve Jobs released the first iPhone, and somebody asked him, one of the reporters afterwards asked him about how the user feedback and all the consumer review stuff that he had done before they released it to see how people like the aesthetics of the design and all. He said, I didn't ask anybody. Didn't ask a single person. I built what needed to be built. And I admire the hell out of that. I think that for a certain percentage of the marketplace, that makes sense. But that's not everybody. But that's the way I operate. It's the way Ben Settle operates. It's the way we both run our businesses in alignment with our approach. You can either follow us or you can go somewhere else, and that's totally cool. But we're not going to chase you, and we're not going to chase trends. We follow our own path, right? Now, that puts a lot of pressure on somebody just getting started that is trying to learn a particular industry, right? It works really well if you've been around the industry for a while, but in the very beginning of your career, it can be very painful. And if you doubt it, go read the Steve Jobs, biography, and how crazy the first few years in business were for him, or the first few years of Microsoft, how crazy that was, living out of their garage, doing whatever they had to do. It's really tough in those first few years. So there is value to looking at trends, but even so, I think there's a way that you can do it strategically and not tactically. I'm not a tactic chaser. You're not going to find me looking at, I need to switch everything around because TikTok is doing so much better than Instagram, or no, it's time to move over to Facebook because now everybody's going back to Facebook and da-da-da. That's tactical chasing. I don't chase tactics, but trend analysis can be very, very strategic. And in fact, I'm recording a training all about this right now for my Memoirs of Mastery subscribers. And it's all about trends and understanding how you can use them in your business in a very strategic way. So that's the way I take it.
Now you're going to drop the mic and say, haha, you got to subscribe to learn, or are you going to give us? I mean, feel
I
like
wanted to see your reaction. I was just screwing with you. He's like, huh? What?
Where are we going with this, man? You're going to leave me hanging?
Podcast over. It's done, Jonathan. Got it in the bag. Let's move on.
Drop the mic, man.
No, here's the thing. I have this phrase that I say all the time, and people always look at me with the same type of reaction. I say it and they look at me like cross-eyed. And I tell them that you can absolutely see the future, but you can't predict the future. And what I mean by that is predicting the future is kind of the Gary V investment model, right? He tries to predict the future. He goes out and funds and does these angel investments with a lot of different startups in a sector that he likes or around technologies that he likes. And he's really trying to just predict which one is going to work out. And he knows that a lot of those are not going to work out. He's made some really good money on some of them, but he's also lost a lot of money on a bunch of them that didn't work out. And the goal is that he's trying to make more money on the winners than he loses on some of the poor investments. And he's just spreading some money around, and he's trying to predict what company is going to do well in a given technology. And most of what he does is in the technology space, but I'm just keeping it focused to that sector. That is a predictive model. And that model is, borderline gambling, right? You can know that AI is going to take off like crazy in the next 10 years. I mean, that, but predicting which company is really going to be the one that gets it and where you want to go throw a bunch of money, that's a different story, right? And so what I like to do is see the future instead. You can absolutely see the future if you understand the one key cornerstone of this, which is adoption rate. If you can understand the adoption rate of a technology, of a product, a service, of an industry, whatever you're studying, if you can get an understanding of the adoption rate and then look at where you are in that adoption rate S curve, okay, then you can absolutely see the future. So the adoption rate S curve, it goes from this, speculation phase where in the beginning you have no idea if it's going to go out, and then you kind of go into this early adopters, and then you go into and you start to see the growth of the industry, right? One of the easiest ways to see this is to just look at some of the trends of the past, big trends, and how they evolved and how they went through this escalation of growth. And so, for example, if you go back and look at the automobile and how quickly it was adopted as a technology, how quickly it grew. Believe it or not, in order to get to about 40% market penetration, it took over 70 years of manufacturing the automobile before it had a 40% of the US Americans, American population had an automobile. So that gives you kind of an idea of timeframes. And then when you start to baseline against that and compare things, you look at electricity. And it took roughly 50 years, not quite, but roughly 50 years before 40% of the US population had electricity since when it was debuted, right? And you can continue to kind of go through this. Studying adoption rate across history and across technology is very, very interesting because it tells you where things are going. Right. And if you see an adoption rate climbing in your particular industry or trends that you can analyze that adoption rate on and know where to go, then you can align yourself with them. Right. The internet, for example, the same type of levels were hit in like 12 years with the internet. I'm sorry, 7 years. And so when you look at the adoption rate acceleration, and then you look at things like, just as an example, if you look at cryptocurrency, before crypto, the internet was the fastest adopted technology of anything in humankind. And crypto is 86% faster adoption rate than even the internet at this point. Now, AI, it's too early to really predict where it is in that growth rate, but it's the next thing, right? So now there's a big difference, however, in chasing tactics and aligning yourself with market adoption. And this is, I think, the subtlety of it all, because people will convince themselves that they're being strategic and they're really just chasing tactics. They're really just chasing short-term trends. I don't look for those short-term trends. I look for big movements. I wait for the market to start to endorse them, and then I get on. Now, I've done this in so many industries over the years. I've done it from land development, of doing land development in Northern California because the trends were people were moving from Southern California into Northern California, and I got in on that adoption rate of that move cycle. And then we moved out of Northern California into Southern Oregon, following again the adoption rate of the trends of moving toward out of Oregon or out of California and moving up to Oregon to kind of escape some of the taxes and the drama. Well, staying ahead of that as a land developer was really, really smart. But you can see the trend already forming. And when you study the adoption rate of those trends, then you can see where it makes sense to get in. Jonathan, podcasting, right? When did podcasting really start? When did it really start?
I mean, the earliest podcast was probably around 2000 or so.
Okay. And so if you got into a podcast in 2000, there was no assurance it was going to go anywhere. That would have been a really kind of risky proposition at that point, right?
You got
But
that right.
after the podcast started really escalating, so what, maybe 2007?
Yeah, 8 is when I was getting into it heavy, and then more mass adoption was around 13, 14.
Yeah.
Where we started seeing it in
13,
cars.
14 is you get into that mass adoption aspect of it, right? Which is different than the early adoption, right? And that's what we look at. So you go from the very, very beginning, the people in 2000, those were the innovators, right? Those were the innovators. The people that got in maybe 2000 to 2007, somewhere in that range, 2006, those are going to be your early adopters. Then you start to get where the curve starts going steeper up. And so now you start getting into the early majority, the late majority, and the laggards. Those are the phases of the adoption curve. We go from innovators to early adopters, early majority, late majority, and laggards. Okay. Getting into starting a podcast today, you're already in that laggard space, right? It's already hit the peak of, not the peak, but where most of the growth of the S curve has already unfolded. It's still growing, but it's growing much slower today than it was in that, early adopter phase of podcasting. And so this is understanding how you can actually see the future. So as an example, let's bring this back to today. If you're a podcaster and you're already in that laggard space, right? You're already in a very mature market where there's not a huge potential more of an upswing from here. It's still going to go up, but not at the way it was going up in 2007, right? It's now more matured. So now the question is, how can you synergize that with other technologies that are in the early phase of adoption rate? And so what I mean by that is, and I'm just speaking out of my ass on this because look, I am not a big lover of AI. We've had many discussions about that. But as an example, okay, no one can argue that AI is in that innovator phase of the S curve. It's very early on, how it's going to shake out, how it's going to inform. But as somebody that's in podcasting, if you can look to understand, watch the trend of AI, see where it goes, and get into the early phases, the early adopter phase of the synergy between AI and podcasting, well, then you start to find some magic, right? Then you start to see where, okay, there's some cool technologies coming forward in AI that could be very, very beneficial to me as a podcaster, that I want to look at how I can streamline into some of that, to take advantage of it to boost where I'm going in my business. And in that sense, you can begin to kind of see the future and get on board earlier and reap some of those earlier rewards. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it's a silly. All I keep picturing in my mind is being out on the water surfing, seeing the swell coming, and knowing, hey, this is the time to paddle in and go. I'm not going to make the wave, but I'm going to paddle into that wave and ride it.
Yeah. And, if you paddle too early, you miss it
Yeah,
entirely and you blow it, right? And if you paddle too late, you
you
miss
miss
it
it.
entirely and you blow it, right? So then it's the question of the timing aspect and trying to, if you hit it at its absolute peak, it'll ride you all the way to the sand, right? It'll
Right.
drop you right off where you can just hop off the board on the sand at that point. If you miss it by a little bit, you'll still get 70% of that. And that's where the adoption rate S curve is so powerful. I think that, this is really interesting too, because I am like emotionally beat myself up for probably 2 decades thinking that I was going in a lot of different directions and that I wasn't focused in on one path. And what I really realized in my maturity a few years ago is that I hadn't been really bouncing around. I had been an early adopter in some really good trends in several different areas. Everything from, oh my God, computers, right? I got my first computer at like 13 years old. I paid $1,200 for it. I saved up 600, and my parents saved 600. My dad, that's the way it was. If you wanted something, you had to pay for half of it. He'd help you and pay the other half, right? And because he wanted to make sure you really wanted it. And so I worked my tush off to save up $600 in 1982 and buy my first computer in 1983. And I got into that was the innovator phase, honestly, of it wasn't even the early adopters, but I did so much for that. Even in high school, I won a county fair first place ribbon for a design CAD project that I had done, where this was the very much the transition from innovators to early adopter phase, probably very early onset early adopter phase of CAD, computer aided design. And so CAD allows you to create these architectural blueprints and things and print them out on a plotter and do it through a computer. And so before then, architects would hand draw everything. I, in high school, had a job teaching the architects in town how to use plotters and CAD and software. I was like 15 years old and I was teaching them how to use Design CAD and AutoCAD. Why? Because I was at that innovator crossover into early adopter phase of that career. So this is something I've been doing since a teenager. And I have just had this innate ability to spot and identify early on solid trends and get into them at the right time. And for a while, I thought, okay, was that luck? Then so I thought I was lucky for a while and patted myself on the back. And then I beat myself up for a lot of years thinking that, I was just scatterbrained jumping around from this to that to the other. But if you go back and look at my career from SEO and services to book publishing to everything that I have done in my software as a service companies, I've always been at that right time of the S curve. And when I acknowledge that, I realize that you really can see the future. You can engineer your entry into technology based on where you see things unfolding. Right. And even in crypto, I bought my first Bitcoin at $110. Bitcoin's selling for mid 60s right now,
Yeah.
60,000s. Right. So, that was definitely an innovator phase. And I got in and out of it a couple times until I really got solid with it. But the point is that you can see the future. And you can do this, Jonathan, by looking at keyword statistics data and seeing how many people are searching on keywords that are relevant to what you sell and watching the growth. If you search on the word podcasting and then look at how many people searched for podcasting 10 years ago versus how many people search for podcasting today, that will give you a really good indicator of where it is on the S curve. And then, it's just aligning your business and your offers with those trends effectively. So I do believe you can use trend analysis effectively without being a tactic chaser. You can still be strategic in your analysis of trends using the S curve adoption rate.
Man, what do you have coming up for us next time, Troy? There's a lot there to unpack.
This next one is going to be fun. We are going to talk about the marshmallow chasing tic tac brain and go into some 70-year-old psychology lessons. So this is going to be fun.
I have a feeling we'll be getting some hate mail for that one. Love it, love it, love it. That is a wrap for another Go Berserk with Email show. Thank you guys for tuning in. And thank you, Troy, as always, for dropping some knowledge on us.
To get a free Berserker Mail test drive with no credit card required, go to startmytestdrive.com. From there, you can play around inside the platform without pressure. Load up emails and campaigns to see how simple the interface is, and get comfy with everything before deciding to join. That's startmytestdrive.com.
This is thepodcastfactory.com.